prison business for 18 years. I felt that murderers and rapists and barbaric people really didn't deserve to be on this earth. I had no sympathy for them whatsoever. I thought I would have no trouble carrying out the ultimate punishment. But those of us who have lived through an execution know just what the death penalty does to those who must perform it. I myself have been haunted by the men I was asked to execute in the name of the state of Florida. Unfortunately, my experience is not unique. Prison officials from all over the country have come forward to tell stories of their suffering and trauma. And you know what? None of us deserve this. Being a correctional officer is supposed to be an honorable profession in the service of the public. And yet the state dishonors us by putting us through these experiences.
So we're going to hear from some experts today. And the first one we're going to hear from is Mr. McAndrew.
As the judge mentioned, my name is Ron McAndrew. I have 23 years experience in corrections. In 1978, I entered the Florida Department of Corrections as an entry-level officer. It's a second career. I had worked in Europe, the Far East and Southeast Asia, in private industry, in international business for almost 20 years. And when I returned home, I needed a job, and that's what I found. By 1992, I had worked my way up through all of the gut-level correctional positions, became a warden of a newly opened correctional institution in Gulf County, Florida, a little town called Hitchcock. Within 2 years, it was the largest facility in Florida, 3,313 inmates and 5 different units. In 1996, I was asked to take over the Florida State Prison in Stark, Florida, home of the death row and the execution chamber. I finished out my career with the state of Florida in 2002, and now I act as a prison and jail consultant working around the United States and as far away as Ireland. I've worked in over 40, actually by this time 50 cases, either as a consultant and or expert witness involving issues ranging from discrimination and prisoner abuse to wrongful termination, murder of a prison official, and the death penalty. When the Secretary of the Florida Department of Corrections first approached me about taking a position at Florida State Prison, he had one question for me. He said, "Ron, are you going to have any problems carrying out the death penalty?" "No, sir," I told him. I was a staunch supporter of the death penalty. Both my cousin and my sister-in-law had been murdered in times past in North Carolina. I had been in the prison business for 18 years. I felt that murderers and rapists and barbaric people really didn't deserve to be on this earth. I had no sympathy for them whatsoever. I thought I would have no trouble carrying out the ultimate punishment. But those of us who have lived through an execution know just what the death penalty does to those who must perform it. In my tenure as a warden, I helped perform 3 electrocutions in Florida, and I shadowed 5 lethal injections in Texas, down in Huntsville. It was after my first execution, a member of my staff told me that it was a tradition for the warden to take the death team out to breakfast. And though the word celebration was not used, that's in fact what it was. There we were, 8 of us, 8 in full uniform, and myself in a suit wearing my badge. We went into Shoney's in Stark, Florida, a prison town where everybody in the restaurant knew exactly who we were and what we had just done. We even got some thumbs up as we went to the back of the restaurant to go to an area they'd cordoned off for us to have our breakfast. I sat down to eat, and I knew that I just couldn't get those eggs and grits down. I was having trouble already after my first execution. I didn't know what was wrong, I just knew that I couldn't eat food. I looked and I saw a woman across sitting in a booth, and she turned, we locked eyes, and I realized suddenly that it was Susan Carey, the attorney who had represented the offender that we had just executed. A woman who had worked for over a decade in his defense. I wasn't the only one affected by these executions. In both Florida and Texas, I saw staff traumatized by the duties they were asked to perform. Officers who had never even met the inmate fought tears and cowered in corners so they wouldn't be seen and wouldn't be taken as a weakness. Many of my colleagues turned to drugs and alcohol to numb the pain of knowing that a man had died at their hands. We never admitted at the time that it would show weakness in a job that demanded strength. But I've spoken out over the years. Many colleagues have contacted me. Sometimes they approach me after a speech I've given, noticeably drying their eyes. Others call me and we spend hours at a time on the phone trying to process the horror that we've been through. Had one phone call at 1 o'clock in the morning where I talked to a man until almost daylight because he was having a horrible time of dealing with the 25 executions he worked at Florida State Prison. I myself have been haunted by the men I was asked to execute in the name of the state of Florida. I used to wake up a lot in the middle of the night to find them lurking, sitting on the edge of my bed. One of the men whose execution I oversaw was literally cooked to death. It was a botched execution. I stood just 4 feet away, watching the flames come from under the copper helmet, smelling the burning flesh, terrified. The executioner, with his powerful lineman gloves on, asked me if we should continue with the execution. What a question. Unfortunately, my experience is not unique. Prison officials from all over the country have come forward to tell stories of their suffering and trauma. Many have quit because they just can't participate anymore. Some have committed suicide, including 2 of the most recent executioners in New York. I sure wish they had called me at 1 o'clock in the morning. I'd have talked to them for days if necessary, or I would have listened to them for days. Jim Willett, who oversaw 89 executions as a warden in Huntsville, Texas, says, "Sometimes I wonder whether people really understand what goes on down here." I know Jim. And the effect it has on us. Killing people, even people you know are heinous criminals, is a gruesome business. And it takes a harsh toll. I have no doubt it's disturbing for all of us. You don't ever get used to it. It's quote unquote by Jim Willett. Don Cabana, the former warden from Mississippi, said, quote, "If the condemned prisoner was some awful monster, why did I feel so bad about it? I wondered. It has been said that men on death row are inhuman, cold-blooded killers. But as I stood and watched a grieving mother leave her son for the last time, I questioned how the sordid business of executions was supposed to be the great equalizer. The last mile seemed an eternity, every step a painful reminder of what waited at the end of the walk. Where was the cold-blooded murder? I wondered as we approached the door to the last night's cell. I have looked for that man before. I still had not found him. I saw in my grasp only a frightened child," unquote. I know Don Cabana, another person I share a lot with over the telephone. And you know what? None of us deserve this. Being a correctional officer is supposed to be an honorable profession in the service of the public. And yet the state dishonors us by putting us through these experiences. As a correctional officer is not a soldier killing the enemy for his country. He's a state public servant who participates in the most premeditated, carefully thought out, ceremonial killing anywhere. As a warden, I'm sworn to ensure the safety of my officers. All wardens are. And the prisoners in my charge. As you've heard, or will hear from the head of security from your secure housing unit, there are many factors that help keep prisons safe. The most important of which is to have a well-trained, professional staff that have adequate wages and benefits and are respected in their positions. Having disgruntled, traumatized, and depressed employees is a recipe for disaster. I implore you, don't get into this business. Honor your corrections officers, and don't force them to go through what I went through. What so many of us have gone through and have suffered for. Don't get me wrong. I'm not soft. I have no sympathy for rapists, killers, and those who prey on the most vulnerable in our country. But life without parole can keep our communities and prisons safe. Life without parole. It's the most severe punishment you could ever give. You lock them in a little cage. It's made of concrete and steel with a steel cot and a stainless steel toilet jacket without a lid. And you leave them in there for the rest of their natural lives. I'm getting some help these days. I have now for 10 years. I'm still in therapy. So have many of my past colleagues. Some of them have turned into drug addicts, alcoholics. They're in terrible shape. We talk a lot. We share our stuff. And we pray that honorable bodies like you will look at the damaged goods that's here talking to you today and think about this as you move forward in considering this beautiful, beautiful, incredibly beautiful state of New Hampshire to take on something like the death penalty. 39 years that you did this. It's a long thing.
I would have a question for either Dr. Alto or McAndrew, and that's, can you talk about what kind of training there is for execution teams and what kind of follow-up there is for people who participate in those killings?
Could you address that, Mr. McAndrew?
Yes, sir. Training, at least in Florida and Texas, is consistent. When an execution order has been signed by the governor, teams begin practicing daily. They use a volunteer officer to play the role of the condemned, and they go through the procedure from the very beginning to the very end, time and again, day after day. We would do it as many as 50, 60, or 70 times prior to an execution.
We've heard some talk that having the death penalty for the murder of a correction officer makes correction officers safer. And you alluded a little bit in your testimony to what you believe makes a prison safe, but could you tell me whether you felt safer because there was a death penalty in the states in which you practiced?
No, sir. Feeling safe in a prison is at the warden's hands. If he wants a safe prison, he's going to keep his ear to the ground. He's going to walk and talk. He's going to train his people and train his people and train his people. He's going to see to it that he has staff that are well paid. He's going to go out and fight for their salaries. He's going to work with Police Benevolent Association unions and fraternal order police unions and people like this to make sure that his staff are coming to work with a positive attitude. You've got people that are coming to work disgruntled, feeling negative and hateful about what they're doing. You're going to have a very dangerous prison. And a warden should be able to recognize that immediately and do something about it.
Mr. McAndrew, it clearly, your testimony and Dr. Alt, you could see the traumatic effect very clearly. Is that across the board in these kinds of institutions where the correctional staff are also traumatized with, it sounds as if some pretty long-standing effects?
Dr. McKay, I would be afraid to say across the board, but I can tell you with the death team members that I've worked with in the past, the majority I have had communications with over the years. Since my retirement, I still communicate with a number of these folks, and I can tell you that we all share the same horrible, down deep feelings.
Mr. McAndrew would like to add something, I believe.
Thank you, Judge Murphy and members of the Commission. I really appreciate this short addendum. I promise it won't be more than 2 minutes. I'd like to say that convicted men and women in this country are sent to prison as punishment. not for punishment. That's the law. And I would be hard-pressed, ladies and gentlemen, to come before this body and to make Warden Bill Gary and Assistant Commissioner Bill McAndrew appear to be running a summer pleasure camp because they have television sets and some ping pong. I would go to the warden's office before I would come here, and I would sit with him, and I would ask him, what's the size of your budget, Warden? How many correctional staff do you have? If I remember my math, I think he has probably about 265 people for 1,500 convicted felons. You divide that, and you subtract annual, sick, and comp leave, and days off, and then you divide them up among shifts, 21 shifts a week, plus your administrative shift during the day, and that means one correctional officer is supervising somewhere between 125 and 200 inmates, all by himself or herself. The television set is a working tool for a correctional officer. It occupies the inmates. It keeps them under control so that this one uniformed person who is unarmed and willing to step inside of a state prison and to do this really tough job for you every day, he has a few tools to work with. I would also ask the warden, don't a lot of these guys have job assignments? Who does the plumbing around the prison? Who helps the electrician? Who does the cleaning? Who scrubs the toilets? Who washes the floors? Who dusts? Who does the kitchen work? Who does most of the cooking? Who does all of the maintenance? Millions of dollars that you would have to pay civilians to do are actually done by prisoners. And yes, they work an 8-hour day, most of them. And then, when they're not working, just as we do, they have leisure time. Once again, I just say that men and women, convicted men and women, are sent to prison as punishment, not for punishment. And I believe that the folks working in your state prison, considering you only have 265 uniformed staff, are doing an amazing job with 1,500 convicted felons here in the state of New Hampshire. Thank you very much.